Hi everyone, here's an interesting question for you. Does the Historia Brittonum actually describe a Trojan migration to Britain? You might be thinking, well, that's a bizarre question. Of course it does. Everyone knows that the Historia Brittonum contains a legendary foundation story of Britain involving Brutus, a descendant of Aeneas of Troy, migrating to Britain and becoming the founder of that nation. So of course there's a migration of Trojans to Britain in the Historia Brittonum. But is it actually as simple as that? Well, as you may have noticed from my summary of the legend, Brutus was not said to have come from Troy. He was said to have come from Italy, but he was a descendant of Aeneas, a Trojan prince. So the Historia Brittonum doesn't actually describe a migration of Trojans from Troy to Britain. What it actually describes is a migration of Trojan descendants from Italy to Britain. Now you might think, well, that's just being pedantic, but actually it's extremely important. Now the reason why it's extremely important is evident for a few reasons. So according to the legend, Aeneas led a migration of the Trojan survivors of the Trojan War to Italy, and then several generations later, Brutus comes along and leads a migration to Britain. So think about that. There are two reasons why it's important to note this. First of all, the time involved. So because the Trojans lived and settled in Italy for about 100 or 200 years before Brutus's migration, that means that the culture of the Trojans could have potentially changed quite a lot before we get to the time of Brutus' migration. So looking for, or trying to find evidence of Trojan culture in Britain is not actually a valid exercise in assessing the historicity of this legend, because the legend doesn't describe a migration of Trojans from Troy to Britain. It describes a migration of Trojan descendants in Italy to Britain. So we should be looking at what it was that the culture evolved into by the time of Brutus' migration, and seeing if we can identify that in Britain. So simply because of the time period, the culture could potentially evolve quite a bit. In addition, the fact that there were obviously people already living in Italy, in the Rome area, when the Trojans arrived, means that we would expect to see, to one degree or another, a kind of mixture of the outside Trojan influence with the internal native influence as well. So we wouldn't expect a pure, unadulterated Trojan culture to have left Italy with Brutus and gone to Britain, even if Brutus's migration had occurred almost immediately after the Trojans arrived in Italy. We would expect to see some kind of fusion, to one degree or another, with the native culture. And so when you combine that with the fact that there was this passage of time before Brutus left Italy, it means that the culture of the Trojan descendants in Brutus's time could potentially have been significantly different from the culture of the Trojans in Troy at the time of the Trojan War. So trying to find, or trying to say that this legend can't be true because there's no evidence of Trojan culture in Britain at any point in history, well, that's not a valid assessment of the historicity of this legend, because that's not what the legend describes. If we want to analyse the historicity of this legend, what we should be looking at is seeing whether or not there's evidence of this early Italic culture in Britain. But the case is actually more complicated than that, because Brutus wasn't said to have gone to Britain directly from Italy. He was actually said to have gone to Gaul first. And the implication, because he's said to have founded a city there, the implication is that he settled there briefly before moving on to Britain. So actually there are three distinct stages to this migration. First, you have the migration from Troy to Italy. Then, several generations later, you have the migration from Italy to Gaul, and then more or less immediately afterwards, at least in archaeological terms, you have a migration from Gaul to Britain. So that's three distinct stages. Now each one of them would inevitably result in changes to one degree or another to the culture of the travelling Trojan descendants. So it's completely pointless trying to find or trying to assess the historicity of this legend by seeing to what degree Britain in the Iron Age displayed Trojan culture, because even if you completely agree that this legend is 100% true, that isn't what you would expect to find. You would expect to find a version of Trojan culture which had evolved over 200 years while being mixed with native Italic culture, and that had then experienced some mixture with native Gallic culture, and then had experienced some mixture with native Brittonic culture as well. That is what you would expect to find, not a pure unadulterated Trojan culture. And that is why it is so important to consider what the legend actually says, rather than just oversimplifying it and making it completely inaccurate by describing a Trojan migration to Britain. To be fair, though, I do talk about a Trojan migration to Britain extensively and in my book as well, for simplicity. But any in-depth analysis of the historicity of this legend needs to appreciate the fact that it was not simply a case of a Trojan migration to Britain. It was far more complicated than that. So, those three stages are interesting because actually only one of them has no academic support. The other two do have academic support. One of them, in fact, is pretty much universally accepted. The other one is not. The general consensus doesn't support it, but it does have some academic support. Only one of the stages has, as far as I'm aware, no academic support at all. So what my book argues isn't actually dramatically outside the realms of what's already accepted in academia. So you'll find out when my book is finally released next year. Yesterday, actually, last night, I was doing the final references, formatting the final references in my book. It has almost 500 references, which is significantly more than I had in my previous book, the one about King Arthur, which had about 170 references. This latest one has almost 500. And just last night I finished formatting them. So I'm very proud of it, and I'm very much looking forward to having it released next year, and you can let me know what you think of it. But the point I'm making is that the argument contained in this book is not dramatically outside the realms of what's already accepted in academia. In fact, only one stage is something which, as far as I'm aware, has never been proposed by any academics before. However, even that isn't actually far removed from what is already universally accepted regarding this particular stage. You'll see what I mean when you read my book. That might sound a little bit complicated, but it will all make sense, I assure you. So that's all for now. See you next time.